The pecs are one of the most distinguishing muscle groups in identifying someone who lifts. In fact, the pecs are likely one of the most commonly trained muscle groups due to the adoration for bench press and push-ups. With that said, it's very common for people to struggle in fully developing their pecs, often having issues with not filling out their upper chest, not having a defined lower chest, or not having enough general mass. One reason individuals struggle in developing their pecs is poor exercise selection. To address this, we need to understand the pec's anatomy, the regional differences, the biomechanical functions of the pec regions, and how we can practically apply this information. The pectoralis major, also known as the pecs, are one of the larger muscles in the upper body. The pecs are often divided into two regions, upper and lower, but it actually appears the pecs have three different subdivisions. The clavicular region, originating at the collarbone and passing diagonally downwards towards the shoulder. The sternal region, originating on the sternum and passing horizontally towards the shoulder. And the costal region, originating on the ribs and passing diagonally upwards towards the shoulder. Altogether, they cross the shoulder and insert on the lateral lip of the bicipital groove on the humerus. Due to these paths, the pecs have a number of different functions. Collectively, the pecs all perform shoulder horizontal adduction, where we bring our arm toward the center of our body. They also perform shoulder internal rotation, where the arm rotates inwards. And in addition to these two main movements, each region performs additional motions. The clavicular region also assists in shoulder flexion and shoulder abduction. The sternal region also assists in shoulder flexion and shoulder adduction. And the costal region also assists in shoulder extension and shoulder adduction. Now, if our goal is to find exercises that best work the pecs, we want to look at when the pecs work best in these different motions. During shoulder flexion, we have muscles like the anterior delt, middle delt, and others who contribute as well as the pec, particularly the clavicular and sternal heads. The pec will have most relative contribution to shoulder flexion at lower angles of shoulder flexion. So when we look at movements that challenge shoulder flexion, such as narrow grip bench press and strict press, the narrow grip bench press will be a better option for the pecs, as it will have more relative challenge at low angles when the pec works most relative to the other muscles. During shoulder extension, we have a range of muscles such as the lats, posterior deltoid, teres major, etc., and the pecs, most notably the costal region. In contrast to shoulder flexion, where the pecs were most involved during the lower range, the pecs are most involved at the higher ranges of shoulder extension. Therefore, doing movements which have a peak challenge closer to the top, such as a pullover, will work the pecs to the highest relative degree. The movements in the frontal plane are similar, where different regions of the pec contribute in both directions. Such as during shoulder abduction, the clavicular region contributes, particularly at high ranges, and the sternal and costal regions contribute to shoulder adduction, particularly at mid-ranges like 45 to 60 degrees. These movements are ones where the pecs work, but are not necessarily top actions for the pecs, particularly shoulder abduction and adduction. Instead, if we look at the fibers of the pecs, it's very noticeable that their main job is to bring the arm closer to midline in the transverse plane. Other than the pecs, this is primarily done by the anterior deltoid and a bit by the subscapularis. The anterior delt has its peak moment arm when the arm is more horizontally extended, also known as reached back. In contrast, the pecs have their peak moment arm at around 45 degrees from center line. This means exercise that have a greater peak challenge, closer to midline, will have more of a focus on the pec versus the anterior deltoid. This is a big point to consider, which we're going to elaborate on more later. As we start to layer on this information together, it can help us in identifying which movements will be most optimal to target the pecs overall and different regions of the pecs. Now, in picking the best exercises, there are a few different considerations. Exercises such as the bench press and push-ups are going to be staples. These are tried and true classics that we all know can build the chest. However, if we look at their execution and the information that we just discussed above, we can also start to factor in ways that we can modify them to really maximize pec focus and regional development. All right, let's get into them. Generally, the bigger the bench, the bigger the pecs. In fact, this has actually been demonstrated in multiple studies, such as Akagi et al. And Ogasawara et al. Both studies saw a strong correlation between an individual's bench press strength and the size of their pec development. This video isn't going to be an in-depth analysis on bench press technique since we have a lot to cover, but if you'd like us to cover bench press more in depth and do a whole video on how to optimally perform it for strength and building your chest, let us know down in the comments. The bench press is a fantastic option for overall development of the pecs. In fact, while many don't think that it works the upper chest, research has actually shown that it can hit each region quite well. Within the bench press category, individuals will often suggest that dumbbell bench press is superior to the barbell bench press for pecs. But we actually don't see that stand up in research. Interestingly, we see that these movements either end up being equal or the barbell bench press is superior. This is likely due to the stability of the movement, allowing you to really load it up and focus on pushing out hard work, not having to emphasize controlling the movement as much. In reality, we don't have to pick just one, so using both is probably ideal. If you're looking to emphasize different regions of the pec though, with bench press, we can make a few changes to our technique to do so. The first change is to our body angle, to alter the relative challenge on shoulder flexion and abduction, which we discussed earlier. By going to a more inclined position, we'll shift more relative loading to the clavicular head. This is due to the line of the fibers we discussed earlier and a greater focus on shoulder flexion. How much of an incline? Well, research generally suggests somewhere between 15 and 45 degrees. It would probably be ideal to shy more towards the lower end of that spectrum if you're focusing on the pecs, since we see that at 30 degrees or more, the anterior delt starts to heavily contribute and the sternal and costal pecs start to lessen. This is going to look like roughly one notch up on most inclined benches. You could alternatively put a bumper plate under one end of a flat bench. We can also reverse this going to a decline if we want to try to emphasize the costal pecs to a greater degree. Just a small decline is ideal, essentially the same subtle angle that we discussed for the incline. The second change to our technique that we can do is a different grip. If you're trying to target more of that clavicular region, you can try using a more narrow grip, as this will encourage more of a focus on shoulder flexion. How narrow of a grip? Well, it's hard to say as there isn't a perfect grip, but generally narrower than your normal grip bench press. In addition to a narrow grip, you can also try using a reverse grip. This variation can put a lot more focus on executing the shoulder flexion pattern during the bench press, which could elicit more focus on the clavicular head. In fact, one study did find that this grip resulted in a greater amplitude out of the upper pecs. It is limited since it's just one study and could be confounded by a few different variables, but if you just try the motion out for yourself, you'll likely feel your upper pecs working harder. If you're not focusing on the upper pecs, you could experiment with a wider grip as well. A wider grip can place more emphasis on the pecs over the triceps and anterior delts in bench press. Then one last thing that you can experiment with to get more pec out of the bench press is using accommodating resistance, such as bands or chains. Earlier we discussed how the pecs get more loaded as we get closer to end range position, so by having some light band resistance, we can put more emphasis on that. You can do this either with a band wrapping from one end of the bar to the other end while going under the bench, or having two heavy dumbbells anchored down and having bands attached up to each end of the bar. Now, we showed all of this in regards to the barbell bench press, but you can very well apply this to the dumbbell bench as well. You can alter your body angle, incline or decline, alter your grip, going more narrow, going wider, or using accommodating resistance. When it comes to compound movements for the pecs, people often think the bench press reigns king, but research generally shows extremely similar improvements for both bench press and push-ups. The key detail is that you have to progressively overload them. That's where many individuals go wrong with push-ups. We need to make them harder and harder as we improve. Firstly, if you can't do a push-up well, check out the link in the description box below, as I'll have a few resources for individuals that need a tutorial on how to do a push-up. Now, to make push-ups harder and more challenging, we have a few options. You can add a plate to your back. This works very well, but can be hard to do by yourself if you get past a single plate. You can also set up a barbell in a rack in line with a bench and then use a dip belt. This is a really good option for those who can stack on multiple plates. And using band resistance. Band resistance is a great option for push-ups as it's very simple, it can be done very quickly, but it also doubles up on being a really effective way to focus on the pecs, as we discussed earlier with the bench press. In fact, researchers looked at band-resisted push-ups and found it can be as effective as bench press when progressively overloaded. Now, in addition to these different ways of making them harder, we can also play around with the points that we discussed earlier for the bench press to hit the different heads. You can go to a more piked push-up to hit more of the clavicular head. I personally like doing this off of parallettes and with my feet slightly elevated so I can get more range and hit that angle. You can also play around with your hand placement. 3 hand placements I'd encourage people to try out are a narrow grip push-up to get more upper pec, a diamond grip push-up to get more of the pecs overall, and an underhand grip push-up to hit the upper pec fibers even more. These 3 can be good variants to add a bit more to your arsenal. As well, something you can experiment with is getting a bit of rotation into your push-ups, such as the rotating push-up. Since the pecs get stretched more as we descend into the bottom position, we can rotate away from one side to get more of a stretch, and then as we go up, we can rotate to that side to work through greater amount of horizontal adduction. Adding in a band is a really great option here, since we can make the bottom position more stretch focused and then focus on a big squeeze at the top. In addition to bench press and push-ups, another compound movement that we can use is dips. The dip is a staple in the calisthenics and gymnastics communities for working the pecs. We actually made a whole video on the technique and progression for dips, so I'm going to link that down in the description box below rather than breaking it all down here for you. In general, we can apply many of the same concepts to dips, such as body angle, grips, accommodating resistance, etc. Now, all of what we've covered so far has been compound movements, and is what should make up the bulk of pec work. In a future video, we're going to be covering isolation movements and how to integrate both compound and isolation movements into your program for maximum pec potential. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.